I still remember the day I met Greg, the new neighbor. He moved into the apartment next to ours, a tall guy with a confident smile and a knack for striking up conversations. At first, he seemed harmless, a bit too chatty maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. My wife, Sarah, and I welcomed him with the usual neighborly pleasantries, offering advice about the local spots and even inviting him over for coffee one weekend. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't been so quick to open that door. It all started innocently enough. Greg was setting up his place and asked Sarah for help with decorating advice. She has an eye for that sort of thing. Our friends always admired her knack for making a space feel like home. I didn't think much of it when she said yes. "Just an hour or two," she said, grabbing her purse one Saturday afternoon. "He's got no idea where to start, poor guy. I'll help him figure out where to put the furniture, and I'll be back in no time." I smiled, kissed her cheek, and told her to take her time. It didn't even cross my mind to question it. Why would it? This was Sarah, my wife of 10 years, my best friend. That was the first time she went over. At first, everything seemed normal. She came back an hour later, shrugging off the visit as uneventful. "His place is a mess," she said, laughing as she recounted Greg's lack of decorating sense. I laughed too. But then, the requests kept coming. "Greg asked if I could help pick out some curtains," she'd say one day. Or, "He's thinking about painting the walls." I told him I'd help him choose a color. The trips to his apartment became more frequent, and each time, they seemed to last just a little longer. I started to notice small things, how she'd come back smiling more than usual, how her tone was lighter when she talked about him. "It's just nice to have someone to talk to," she told me when I jokingly mentioned that she was spending more time at Greg's than with me. She laughed, and I forced myself to laugh too, even as something uneasy churned in my stomach. It wasn't until I saw her phone buzzing one evening, Greg's name lighting up the screen, that the first real seed of doubt took root in my mind. "Why's he texting you at this hour?" I asked casually, not wanting to seem paranoid. "Oh, he just had a question about the lamp I suggested," she replied, brushing it off. She put her phone down without replying and kissed me on the cheek. But the doubt lingered. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped or interrogated his wife about every little thing, so I let it go. Or at least I tried to. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. It was a Tuesday evening when the first undeniable sign slapped me across the face. Sarah had gone over to Greg's apartment again, this time to help arrange the art pieces he'd bought. I told her I'd make dinner, so I wasn't too concerned about the time. But hours passed. The spaghetti sat untouched on the table, the sauce slowly cooling. I glanced at the clock, 9 p.m. She'd left at 6:30. I grabbed my phone and texted her. "Me, everything okay?" No response. 10 minutes later, I texted again. "Me, are you coming home soon?" Again, no reply. My chest tightened as the silence stretched on. It wasn't until almost 10 p.m. that I heard the sound of the front door opening. Sarah walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her purse on the counter. "We got caught up rearranging everything, and time just flew by." I tried to keep my tone light, even though my frustration was bubbling just beneath the surface. "You could have at least texted me back. I was starting to worry." She looked surprised. "Oh, I didn't even notice your messages. My phone was on silent. I didn't mean to ignore you." She kissed me on the cheek, and just like that, the conversation was over. But something about the way she shrugged off my concern didn't sit right with me. That night, I lay awake while she slept soundly beside me. My mind raced as I replayed the last few weeks in my head. The late nights, the constant excuses, the way she lit up whenever Greg's name came up in conversation. It was all starting to add up to something I didn't want to admit. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. While Sarah was in the shower, I checked her phone. I wasn't proud of it, but the knot in my gut told me I couldn't ignore my instincts any longer. I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding with every swipe. Most of the texts were innocent, just friendly exchanges about furniture and decor. But then I saw one from the night before. "Greg, thanks for staying so late. Couldn't have done it without you." It was followed by a winking emoji. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. She hadn't replied, at least not that I could see. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, careful not to leave any trace of what I'd done. When she came out of the bathroom, humming to herself, I forced a smile and acted like nothing was wrong. But inside, everything was starting to crack. I couldn't get Greg's message out of my head. The way he'd thanked her, the winking emoji, it gnawed at me like a splinter under my skin. But I couldn't confront her with just that. It wasn't enough. So, I decided to keep watching. The following weekend, Sarah told me she was heading over to Greg's place again. He needs help picking out rugs, she said casually, grabbing her keys. You've been helping him a lot lately, I said, trying to sound neutral. She hesitated for just a moment before replying, well, he doesn't know anyone else in the area. I feel bad for him, you know? He's new here. I nodded, forcing myself to let her leave without saying anything else. But as soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my jacket and followed. I stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen, my heart racing as I watched her enter Greg's apartment. I waited outside in my car, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. I couldn't believe what I was doing, staking out my own wife like some amateur detective. At first, nothing happened. I sat there, staring at the dimly lit windows of Greg's place, feeling like a fool. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she really was just helping him with rugs. But then I saw it. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Sarah laughing. She was holding a glass of wine, her head tilted back as Greg leaned in close to her. It wasn't just the laughter. It was the way she looked at him, the way her body language screamed comfort and familiarity. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how you behaved with a neighbor. I didn't barge in. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was spinning too fast to think straight. Instead, I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When Sarah finally came home that night, she was all smiles, carrying a small shopping bag. Greg gave me this candle, she said, pulling out an expensive-looking jar. He said it was a thank you for helping him. I stared at the candle, my stomach churning. She looked so casual, so at ease, as if nothing was wrong. Nice of him, I said flatly, trying to keep my emotions in check. But inside, I was falling apart. The unease clawed at me every day after that night. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sit through a single conversation without my mind drifting back to that window, to the way she'd laughed with him, wine glass in hand. I knew I couldn't keep going like this. It was eating me alive. The following week, Sarah told me she was going to Greg's again, this time to help him arrange the bookshelves. Something in me snapped. I couldn't keep waiting on the sidelines, piecing together scraps of evidence. I needed answers. When she left, I waited 15 minutes and then marched straight to Greg's door. My hands were trembling as I knocked, my stomach twisting into knots. Greg opened the door, his expression startled. "Oh, hey," he said, flashing that easygoing grin. "What's up, man?" I forced a smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "Sarah said she was helping you with your bookshelves. Just wanted to see if she needed anything from the house." Greg hesitated for a fraction of a second, his smile faltering. No, we're good. Thanks, though." I peeked over his shoulder, and there she was, Sarah, standing near the couch, holding a small stack of books. She looked up, her eyes widening when she saw me. "Ethan," she said, her voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "Thought I'd stop by, see how it's going." Her reaction was immediate, too immediate. She laughed, but it was forced, her smile tight. "It's fine, really. You didn't have to come all this way." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I nodded, stepping back. "All right, I'll leave you to it." As I walked away, I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't turn around. When Sarah came home later that evening, she seemed distant, her answers to my questions clipped and vague. I didn't push her, though my suspicions were screaming louder than ever. The next day, I took a bold step. While Sarah was in the shower, I went to Greg's apartment while I knew he was at work. I had no plan, just desperation and the gnawing need to know the truth. I knocked on his door, pretending to look for him, but no one answered. That's when I noticed it. The door wasn't locked. My hands trembled as I pushed it open, stepping inside. His apartment smelled faintly of cologne and scented candles, probably the one he'd gifted Sarah. The place was neat, almost too neat, but I wasn't there to admire his cleaning skills. I started looking around, feeling like a burglar but too far gone to stop. And then I saw it. Sarah's scarf, draped over the back of a chair. It was unmistakable, a bright green scarf I'd given her for Christmas last year. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the scarf. On the coffee table was her favorite pin, the one she always carried in her bag. And tucked beneath a stack of papers was a small notebook. Hers, without a doubt. I stood there frozen, the pieces clicking together in my mind. She hadn't just been helping him. She'd made herself comfortable in his space, leaving parts of herself behind. When I got home, Sarah was waiting for me, her expression unreadable. "Greg said you stopped by today," she said casually, her tone light, though I could hear the edge beneath it. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Thought I'd check in. Everything okay?" She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? But we both knew the answer to that question. I didn't say anything that night. I couldn't, not yet. I needed more than scarves and pins to confirm what my gut already knew. The next few days were tense, every interaction with Sarah charged with unspoken words. She acted normal, smiling and chatting like nothing was wrong, but I could see the cracks in her facade. Her laugh didn't sound the same, and she avoided eye contact more than usual. Then, 2 nights later, I found my opportunity. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV. Her phone sat on the coffee table, unlocked, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. I knew this was my chance. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and opened her messages. I scrolled past the usual chats with friends and family, my heart racing as I looked for Greg's name. There it was. The thread wasn't long, but it was enough. "Greg, can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? Sarah, I'll find a way. Just give me some time." My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled up, reading through messages that made my stomach churn. Flirty banter, plans to meet, inside jokes that had no place in a neighborly relationship. One message stopped me cold. "Greg, are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" "Sarah, don't worry. Ethan's not the type to notice." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Not the type to notice? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep reading, even as the anger boiled inside me. I put the phone back where I found it and stared at Sarah as she slept peacefully, completely unaware that her secret was unraveling. The next morning, I decided it was time to confront her. She was in the kitchen, making coffee, humming softly to herself. I watched her for a moment, trying to find the words, but all I could feel was the weight of betrayal crushing down on me. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady but firm. She turned, her smile fading when she saw my expression. "What's wrong?" "I need to ask you something," I said, stepping closer. "And I need you to be honest with me." Her eyes flickered with something. Panic, maybe? But she masked it quickly. "Of course," she said, her tone calm but careful. "How long has this been going on with Greg?" Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Don't play dumb, Sarah. I know. I've seen the texts. I've seen the way you act around him. So, tell me how long." For a moment, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Then, finally, she sighed and looked away. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife has been sneaking around with the guy next door while I sit here like an idiot, trusting her." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. "Ethan, I never meant for it to get this far," she said, her voice trembling. "It just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated bitterly. "That's your excuse? You betrayed me, Sarah. You lied to me. You made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "No more lies," I said coldly. "I deserve the truth, Sarah. All of it." She looked at me, her face crumpling as the weight of her guilt finally broke through. And then she told me everything. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter for support. It started a few months ago, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt my chest tighten. A few months? All this time, while I was busy working late nights and trying to keep our lives running smoothly, she had been sneaking around with him. Why? I asked, my voice low but sharp. Why would you do this? She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't planned, Ethan. I swear. At first, it was just harmless. He was lonely, and we started talking. But then, things got complicated. Complicated? I repeated, my tone laced with bitterness. That's one way to put it. So what? You decided to throw away 10 years of marriage for complicated? She winced at my words, but I couldn't stop. The floodgates had opened, and everything I'd been holding back came pouring out. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? I said, my voice rising. You've been lying to my face, making me think I was imagining things, all while sneaking off to his place. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, tears streaming down her face. I wasn't trying to replace you, Ethan. It felt good to be noticed again. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. Noticed? I said, shaking my head. You think I haven't noticed you? Everything I've done, working late, saving for our future, has been for you, for us. And this is how you repay me? She tried to step closer, reaching out to me, but I pulled back. Don't, I said sharply. Don't touch me. We stood there in silence, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make her feel the pain she caused me. But instead, I just stared at her, my heart breaking a little more with each passing second. Is it over? I finally asked. Whatever it is you have with him, is it done? She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I found my answer. It's not that simple, she said softly, avoiding my gaze. I laughed bitterly. Not that simple? It's a yes or no question, Sarah. Either you're done with him, or you're not. Her silence said everything I needed to know. I shook my head, feeling a cold, hollow emptiness settle over me. I can't do this, I said, my voice trembling. I can't be the guy who sits here while his wife decides if she's done with the neighbor. Ethan, please, she said, stepping closer again. I'll fix this. I'll make it right. Just give me a chance. I looked at her, the woman I had loved with everything I had, and felt a sharp pang of anger and sorrow. You already had your chance, I said quietly. You had 10 years' worth of chances. And with that, I turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there, tears streaming down her face. I drove aimlessly for hours after walking out, the weight of Sarah's betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind raced with fragments of our life together. The vacations, the quiet nights on the couch, the dreams we'd once shared. All of it felt tainted now, like every happy memory was just another lie. Eventually, I pulled into a quiet parking lot by the lake. It was a spot Sarah and I used to come to when we first started dating, back when everything felt so simple and full of promise. Sitting there, staring out at the water, I couldn't help but wonder where it all went wrong. Had I missed the signs? Was I too focused on work, on providing for us, to notice her slipping away? Or was it her, choosing to step outside our marriage instead of facing whatever was making her unhappy? The questions churned in my mind until I felt sick. There were no answers, just the dull ache of betrayal and the crushing realization that the life I thought I'd built was crumbling around me. When I finally went home, it was past midnight. The house was dark, but I could see a light on in the living room. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when I walked in, but I didn't say anything. I just walked past her and went straight to the bedroom. The next few days were a blur. We barely spoke, navigating around each other like strangers sharing the same space. She tried to reach out a few times, apologizing, begging me to talk, but I couldn't. Not yet. It wasn't until I was alone in the house one evening, scrolling through my phone, that I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I went through her messages again. This time, I wasn't looking for proof. I already knew the truth. I was looking for answers. I scrolled through her texts with Greg, my chest tightening with every message. The flirtation, the shared secrets, the plans to meet. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. Greg, I can't wait for the weekend. I'll finally have you all to myself. Sarah, I just need to figure out how to handle Ethan. He's been suspicious lately. The weekend. They had plans. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd ever experienced. They weren't just sneaking around. They were making plans, strategizing, treating me like some obstacle they needed to handle. That's when I decided enough was enough. The texts played in my mind on an endless loop. I'll finally have you all to myself. The smug audacity of it made my blood boil. Greg wasn't just some mistake or passing infatuation. He was deliberate, calculated, and comfortable inserting himself into my life. And Sarah? She wasn't some innocent bystander swept up in a moment of weakness. She'd made her choice, over and over again. I realized then that confronting her wasn't enough. Words wouldn't change anything, not when they'd both already dismissed me as some clueless, easily manipulated husband. If they thought I was blind to their betrayal, I was about to show them just how wrong they were. The first thing I did was dig through our shared finances. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I found it quickly enough. Multiple cash withdrawals Sarah had made over the past few months. They were small, just enough to avoid drawing attention, but they added up. She was funding her little rendezvous with Greg, and she'd been using my hard-earned money to do it. The betrayal burned all over again, but I forced myself to focus. This was no longer about trying to fix things or salvage the wreckage of our marriage. This was about reclaiming control, about showing them that I wasn't the naive fool they thought I was. The next step was Greg. If he thought he could waltz into my life, steal my wife, and escape unscathed, he was in for a rude awakening. I started researching him, digging into his online presence, his work, and even his social media accounts. What I found didn't surprise me. He was flashy, self-absorbed, and clearly obsessed with his image. His Instagram was a curated highlight reel of his life. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, exotic vacations. He was the kind of guy who thrived on attention, who needed to feel admired. I knew exactly how to hit him where it would hurt the most. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Screenshots of Sarah's messages, pictures I'd taken of her scarf and notebook in his apartment, and the damning financial records. Then I waited for the weekend, the one Greg had been so excited for, to put my plan into motion. When Saturday arrived, Sarah left the house in the late afternoon, claiming she was meeting a friend for dinner. I didn't even bother pretending to believe her. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed the envelope of evidence I'd prepared and headed to Greg's apartment. I knocked on Greg's door, my heart pounding. When he opened it, his smug grin instantly vanished as he realized who was standing there. "Ethan," he said, trying to play it cool. "Didn't expect to see you here. Is everything okay?" I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, my eyes scanning the apartment. It was meticulously clean, no sign of Sarah yet. "Where is she?" I asked coldly. "Who?" Greg feigned ignorance, but his nervous glance toward the hallway betrayed him. "Don't insult my intelligence," I said, pulling the envelope out of my bag and dropping it on his coffee table. "Take a look." He hesitated but finally opened the envelope. As he sifted through the photos, screenshots, and financial records, his confident demeanor crumbled. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, looking up at me with wide eyes. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice calm but laced with venom. "You've been sneaking around with my wife, lying to my face, and now you're going to pay for it." Before Greg could respond, the front door opened, and Sarah walked in. She froze when she saw me, her face draining of color. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking. I turned to her, my gaze icy. "Surprised to see me?" She didn't respond, her eyes darting between me and Greg. "I know everything, Sarah," I said, my voice rising. "The texts, the money, the plans. I've been patient, but I'm done playing your game." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but she quickly closed it, realizing there was no point. "Ethan, let's talk about this," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. "Talk?" I said, laughing bitterly. Talk about what? How you betrayed me. How you planned to leave me in the dark while you ran off with him. She flinched at my words but didn't deny them. Greg, now pale and visibly shaken, tried to intervene. Look, man, I didn't mean. I cut him off with a glare. You didn't mean to what? Sleep with my wife? Steal from me? You're nothing but a parasite, Greg. Ethan, please, Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want it to happen this way. You didn't want it to happen this way? I snapped, my voice shaking with anger. What exactly did you want, Sarah? For me to find out later, when you'd already moved in here with him? She said nothing, her silence speaking louder than any words could. I turned to Greg, my voice cold and measured. Here's what's going to happen. I've got enough evidence to ruin you, personally and professionally. If you so much as breathe near my wife again, I'll make sure everyone in your life sees what kind of man you really are. Greg swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Understood, he mumbled, clearly terrified. And you, I said, turning back to Sarah. We're done. I'll be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. Ethan, please, she said, her voice breaking. I made a mistake, but I still love you. We can fix this. I shook my head, my chest tight with pain and anger. You don't destroy someone you love, Sarah. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal battles, paperwork, and awkward encounters. Sarah begged me to reconsider, but I refused to budge. The trust we'd built over 10 years had been shattered, and there was no piecing it back together. Greg, true to his cowardly nature, vanished from our lives entirely. He moved out of the apartment a week after the confrontation, leaving behind nothing but the bitter memory of his betrayal. Sarah stayed in the house for a while, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner reminded me of what I'd lost, of the life I thought we had. Despite the pain, I knew I couldn't let this define me. I started going to the gym, channeling my anger and frustration into something productive. I reconnected with old friends, people I drifted away from during the years I'd spent trying to hold my marriage together. Bit by bit, I began to rebuild myself, finding strength in the parts of me that Sarah and Greg hadn't broken. One day, while cleaning out the house, I found a journal Sarah had left behind. Against my better judgment, I opened it and read the entries. It was filled with confessions, guilt over what she'd done, regret for the choices she'd made, and a painful acknowledgement of how she'd let her insecurities drive her to destroy our marriage. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it was quickly drowned out by the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. My revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't involve shouting matches or public humiliation. It was quiet, methodical, and devastating. I filed for divorce, taking everything I was entitled to, the house, the savings, and a significant portion of our shared assets. I made sure Sarah left with the bare minimum, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. But my true revenge was in reclaiming my life. I didn't let her betrayal break me. Instead, I used it as fuel to build something better, a life free of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Sarah was struggling. Her relationship with Greg long since fizzled out. As for me, I was thriving, stronger and more confident than I'd ever been. She had underestimated me, and in doing so, she had lost the one person who truly cared for her. And that was revenge enough.